that were concentrated in the cities. But most poor people were farmers, and these farmers were not connected to each other. They had no education whatsoever, not lowly educated, just not educated, couldn't read, couldn't count. They could just hold a shovel because that's what they were told to do. So the working class was extremely weak organized. And Marx thought that you would have time to form a communist party in a democratic system, not with the aim of winning elections, but just with the aim of forming the party and having meetings and growing and printing propaganda, etc., like he did with Labour, which his daughter or granddaughter founded in the UK. In Russia, there was no democracy. For the most part, Lenin's party was forbidden. Then you had the times of the Duma, but half the time he was banned from that also. So you just had one seat of him, and then all the rest was underground. So there was no democracy. The secret police was constantly trying to hunt him down. He wasn't even there. He was in Switzerland most of the time because they tried to kill him. So that was just not an option. You couldn't build this mass party and then recruit all these working class people in it because they would get killed or sent to prison, and many people did. So in many ways, Russia was the exact opposite of what Marx predicted. Marx said very literally that revolution was not going to happen there. It was going to happen in the West. But Lenin, he didn't want to hear this, right? People were starving, World War I. It was time to do something, or too many people would suffer. So he wanted to make the revolution happen. And how did he did it? So this is where Leninism starts. How do you build a movement, right? As I said, it's very hard to build this mass movement for a revolution because it was illegal, because workers were a minority, and because most of these workers were poorly educated. Not uneducated, unlike the farmers, but low educated. And so you had very few critical mass there. So Lenin noticed that the people were potentially on his side. They were very angry at the government, and they were hungry, and they had some socialist ideas, but they were not ready to have this revolution as a majority, at least, because they would involve the farmers, and they didn't want to hear about this, or they couldn't hear about this because they lived in some village on a mountain. So he came with the concept of vanguard. This is typical concept for Leninism that you might want to remember. What's a vanguard in normal English? A vanguard is a military term that denotes the back of an army. So if you have an army, if you imagine it as a column, like an army moving from one city to the other, right? Imagine Guardia Nacional patrol. You have a rear guard. Vanguard is the front of an army, not the back. You have a rear guard. That are the people who watch your back so that you don't get encircled. Then you have the body of the army. And then in front you have scouts who kind of race ahead a few kilometers to see if there are no ambushes. That's called a vanguard in military terms. So the vanguard are the people who are in front of the army, let's say. And he thought that we needed a political vanguard. We need a smaller group of revolutionaries that will walk ahead, that is one step ahead of the revolution, that will lead the working class. They are working class, but they are, let's say, the most educated part of the working class, ones who taught themselves how to read and write and could read the Communist Manifesto. Those folks, they would guide the rest of the working class into revolution and then establish the dictatorship of this proletariat, of this working class, even if that was a minority at some point. So the idea was, we're going to basically shape this revolution by starting it. We're going to start fighting. We're going to try to win power. People will see that it's working. They're going to join us. And then we're going to use this political power to grab all power and then, let's say, invite everybody into the party. So the idea is that you can start a revolution without mass support as long as you have a working class core that as potential support. They have to be popular amongst the population already with the majority, but maybe the majority doesn't want to start the fight yet because they're scared. So you go ahead. So you have a proletarian leadership that's urban, that's in cities, because this was a big strength. The workers, there were not many of them, but they were very concentrated. Russia had absolutely massive factories of like 36,000 people in one factory. So it was easy to organize this urban working class. You just had to walk in, like you often did, and climb on the highest box you can find and start talking to these people before the guards come and beat you up. So it was not that hard to organize people in the cities. They would then organize, they would drag with them all their family and friends, the entire proletariat, and that would drag in the farmers later. So the revolution was going to build its popular support on the road, let's say. As long as they were generally popular or seen as favorable or at least neutral, that people didn't hate them, he thought it was possible. And so he tried to force this, right? And it worked. He took the power. A bit later, the people did join his revolution. They did fight for him, the majority, in the civil war. And he won against all the odds. So there was a kind of a crisis in Marxist theory, because this was not supposed to happen, but he did it. So now the theory had to change to Leninism instead of normal Marxism. And this was very inspirational for people all over the world, right? That the guy from a poor country did it. So that means everybody can do it. Now the difference is, because of this vanguard concept, you have room for something like an elite. Not an elite in the sense that they are richer than other people, but an elite in the sense that they are, you know, a bit like Plato's guardian class. Like they're smarter than the rest. So Leninism appeals a lot to intellectuals because there's a space for us, right? You can feel cozy. It's not just working class. The academics can join too. Yay. I think that's partly why with academia this is popular. So if you want me to repeat something or clarify, please interrupt me, right? I'm here for you. I'm just going to keep talking, if not. All right. So how did he want the state to look like, right? Well, he had this concept called democratic centralism. Democratic here meant majority, of course, not multi-party elections or something like that. But he wanted the country to be democratic, to be open, but centralized at the same time. So he said we should have all power in the Communist Party, which is his party, but that party itself is going to be democratic. So internally, you have to debate people in like the Greek ideal of democracy, right? You always have committees, you're never alone. You always have to convince at least 10 other people of whatever you do. That included himself. He didn't rule alone. He ruled as a group of 10 people. And he was just the guy who would lead the meetings. But if they outvoted him, it wouldn't happen. He was not a dictator in the sense that he had all the power in himself. He was just the leader of the pack. So internal, you had free speech within the party. We're talking about Lenin, right? All of this disappeared after Lenin died. But while he was alive, you had free speech. But when they decided something, you had to follow. That's what the centralism part is. So until the vote happened, everybody can make their case and speak their mind. But once we have consensus, you have to follow the line of the party. That's the combination of democratic and centralism. Internally, it was democratic in the sense that you had elections. You couldn't be a leader without support of the people below you, and then they would elect you up. I explained this the other time, right? And at the top, you had this small vanguard of leaders, but they themselves were still elected. And Lenin was not the emperor of this. He often didn't get his way. And just to tell you an anecdote, that Lenin really was not a god. Lenin got shot after the revolution. No, he didn't get shot. He also got shot. But they carjacked him. Yeah, you cannot imagine carjacking happening to, you know, Xi of China or someone, right? The current president. Like he was just driving and they held up his car, not to kill him, but to steal his car, right? So very few dictators get carjacked. Lenin did, which means that he was not, godlike. And he did have some form of repression, which was basically to arrest his opponents. He did not massively kill people or have massacres. There were massacres, but they were part of the civil war, as in they killed the enemy because they were fighting. But he did not have this giant police. Well, he had a police apparatus, but it was secret. Then economically, he wanted to do this bottom up, everybody has their own piece of land thing, but he couldn't because of the war. First World War One, then the Civil War. This you couldn't do this utopian stuff. People were starving. There was a famine happening that started before he became president. So he tried to have this nationalization of the economy. He had the idea that the state should first own everything and then we're going to give it back. And he genuinely planned on doing this, right? This was not like, oh, in 300 years, more like in 5 years or something when the war is over, we're going to do this. But, well, then he died. So that didn't happen. So that's Leninism. The idea of the vanguard, which is the main concept that he brought into the theory. The idea that the revolution is not just people one day rising up, but you have a professional kind of elite of the working class who are working class but higher educated, and they will lead the way. And this worked in many countries. This worked in Cuba, this worked in Vietnam, this worked in China. He was onto something with this concept, even if he strayed a bit away from Marxism, right? Any questions about my man Lenin?
Me, in the
Yes.
in the vanguard concept, does he it is a way to include like the middle class or something?
No, it's a way to include intellectuals. So they can have a middle class background, but like middle class in the sense that you own a small shop or something. That he tolerated this. So he never nationalized everything. He nationalized big industry. But people could have corner shops and you could sell tacos and that kind of stuff. Because, well, not that he liked that, but he didn't want to go too fast with things because of the famine that was happening. He didn't want to eliminate markets completely. So he included the middle class in a practical sense, but no, the idea was that the working class would lead. There was also almost no middle class. The middle class that existed, if you see middle class just as middle income, would be rich farmers. So you had some farmers that they're called kulaks in Russian. You might have heard this word. They're farmers that have other farmers work for them. They're like, well, like you have in Mexico, right? A lot of farmers don't actually work on a farm. They just drive by in their truck and they yell at people and then the people do what they want. That kind of farmers you had, that was like the middle class. They were not included. He hated them. But the urban middle class, like shopkeepers and teachers and stuff like that, he was friendly or neutral towards them. Yes.
Okay.
But the vanguard is more about having a leadership, as opposed to anarchism, for example, right, where you don't have this. But he came with the organized, a bunch of very serious people that were professional revolutionaries. So their life was about politics. They were not people doing this in their free time.
Okay, I got it.
Help?
Yeah,
Okay.
it helped. Thanks.
Any other questions or maybe things you want to say or things that you heard about Lenin?
From what part of Russia was Lenin?
It's a good question. I think I'm not certain. I should know this. I'm not certain. I think he was from around the capital of Leningrad. Oh, not Leningrad, because that was named after him. What was it called? St. Petersburg, Petrograd before him. But I'm not certain. Yeah. It didn't really matter because he started moving around very young. As soon as his brother got killed, he was like, oh man, Staying safe here. I gotta move. But I do not know. I'm sorry. But Leningrad is a city named after him. I don't know if he's from there. Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was the early capital. All right. So Lenin dies of a stroke. And then there is a power vacuum after him. Not that he held all the power, but he was the moral leader. Like, people just respected him. He was the OG. Then there were basically two options. I thought there were 10, but there were two, within the group of 10, there were two leaders. One of them was Stalin, the other was Trotsky. We'll talk about Stalin first because he won this. Lenin never liked him, but he was part of the boys. Lenin explicitly said not to make Stalin the leader, actually, because he thought he was insane. Not insane. He thought Stalin is paranoid, and if we give him power, he's gonna kill you. And he was right, but they never stopped him. So who's Stalin? Joseph Stalin. He was the dictator of the Soviet Union. He ruled as a chairman of the Soviet Union. Still as a part of a group of 10, but let's say everybody at the table knew that they couldn't mess with him. So in theory, he ruled as part of this 10 people, but in practice, not. So he made his own doctrine called Stalinism, which is what communism, if you think about communism, that's what most people think of, because that's the system that became dominant. So Stalin was not Russian. He was from Georgia, not Georgia, US, but Georgia, the country, which became part of the Soviet Union. He was he working class? Yes, he was actually working class. He grew up poor. He's one of the only people actually in the party that was genuine working class. He grew up in a very poor family, but he somehow was able to go into school because he was smart. Miss Sophia.
Sorry, Lenin wasn't part of the working class?
Lenin grew up somewhat middle class. I think Lenin was a teacher. So yeah, I mean, he was not rich by any account. Like, he struggled, like I struggle. I'm a teacher. I earn working class wage. I live here in San Pedro because mainly my wife earns a lot. But no, but he didn't work in a factory. No.
He struggled, but he didn't struggle a lot, like a working
It's
class.
like Marx. Marx was never working class because he never worked in a factory or anything. But Marx was poor, and a lot of his kids died of hunger, and they shared the same hardship in a way, but they were not workers. But Stalin's parents, like, I don't know what Lenin's parents did. I think they were like lower clerks somewhere. Stalin's parents were actually poor. He did go to school, and he was very good. He was very smart, so he was able to stay in school and get some scholarship. So he studied theology. He was in preschool. That's why he could go to school. But there was one problem. Problem was that he was atheist. So at some point they had to kick him out of the preschool because he disagreed on some fundamental issues with them. And then he became communist. He was also a poet. Like most authoritarians, they have some feeling for art, right? Hitler had the thing too. Except that Stalin was actually successful as a poet. But anyway, he became with the communists, and he rose to the ranks, to this democratic thing, got elected. He was a bit Machiavellian. Sometimes he backstabbed his opponent. That's how he got higher. But anyway, he reached the top. And then inherited it. He outmaneuvered his opponents. He got a majority within the 10 group, and then he became the chairman. Then he killed the others at some point, and replaced them with more loyal people. So Stalin, the main association of Stalin is that he's very hardline, right? Stalin in more European languages has the connotation of steel. So steel man, Stalin. The man of steel, which what he kind of was, but he also was more conservative. So he was hardline, but Stalin was less of a. He played it safe in many ways, as we will see. He's mostly known, though, for the hard repression of the opposition. Stalin killed a lot of people, not by accident, but by that guy should die, kill him now decree of the opposition, but mainly of opposition to himself. So most people he killed were not even anti-communists. Most people he killed were communists. He killed a lot of his own soldiers. Basically, he was paranoid. That's why Lenin thought he was insane, because he was. He thought people were constantly plotting against him. And so he was constantly trying to not to be surrounded by giants, let's say. He also was quite repressive against the other elite, although not as murderous with them, just repressive. So he hated these wealthy farmers that I just explained. And he was not popular. This became very clear the moment he died. The people that survived him, they started an anti-Stalinization. They started a de-Stalinization campaign. They basically start openly talking about how bad this was, which I think not a lot of people in the West knew. That Stalin was most criticized by his own people and openly on TV, as in this was terrible. We should never do this again. So they had this big moment of openness after he died, by my man Khrushchev, who I think was the best president, but he was not a terrorist, so we're not talking about him. So anyway, Stalin, not a popular guy. Well, he was popular while he was alive, but then when people knew the truth, not so much. But he did get things done. So let's talk about his theory, because he was very influential. One of the main things where he differed from the old Marxism is in his concept of socialism in one country, which means communism in one country, right? He used the word socialism in the old school sense. So his plan was to do communism just in Russia. Marxism is an internationalist theory, right? There's the global working class against the global capitalist class. And thus you should have a revolution everywhere. But Stalin simply saw that this was not happening, right? The German Revolution got defeated. Everywhere else they got defeated. They died. They tried to do what Lenin did. It didn't work. So by the 1920s, by the time he got to power, by 1926, etc., it was just Russia, and well, Russia. There was the Soviet Union. Nothing much was happening. So he thought, well, I'm not going to wait around for these other people. I'm not just going to give up, like, oh, no help is coming. Ah, well, let's just quit and give the keys back to the capitalists. He said, we have to do this on our own. Us against the world, basically. And this was very literal, him against the world, because everybody was trying to destroy the Soviet Union. This became very real when the Nazis attacked, right? This was literally them against the world. Soviet Union suffered 28 million deaths in World War II. I want always to stress this number. 28 million is 1 in 3 people. Imagine in Mexico, 1 in 3 people dying, right? So he justly felt like things were against him. And he thought, well, we need to do this on our own. We need to be strong. There's not going to happen. There's no world. We're not going to defeat capitalism. At least we are not going to do it. Capitalism might collapse, but that is not my problem. My problem is feeding my own people, right? So he turned inwards. It was this inward-focused communism that you also see a bit in Cuba, etc. Less, but you know, a lot of communist regimes focused on this idea of autonomy, and that comes from Stalin. So he abandoned this international idea of revolution from Marxism, and he introduced nationalism, which was previously absent. Communists were not nationalists. They didn't really care about borders. Marx was very explicit on this. But Stalin brought this into the game. So you now had a combination of communism and nationalism, which worked, right? The idea was to be autonomous, we have our working class state over here. And that made his communism quite resilient, because people were inspired by two things: either love for the fatherland, or love for the utopian ideal, right? But it was quite easy to motivate people if this is your ideology, because you have two type of identities going on at the same time. The negative side of this is that Stalin, he didn't really care about other countries. So he did see the Soviet Union as the leader of the communist world. So it became a little bit imperialist in that sense, that they were the top dogs, and they would treat other countries not necessarily with the same respect that Lenin would have treated them. Yet, on the other hand, he also left them alone. It is historically true that Soviet Union expanded and that Stalin did, let's say, conquer half of Europe. Not for Soviet Union, they became independent communist countries. But this just happened to him. He never planned this. World War started, he beat the Germans, and when the dust was settled, well, his army was all over Europe. So he was there already. And then, well, he took part of it, and he made them independent states again, and they left. So is one of this sometimes misunderstood. Stalin never tried to conquer the world. He had absolutely no ambition of doing this, and he generally just wanted to leave the West alone. From him comes this idea of this big standoff in the Cold War, of this kind of mutual leaving each other alone concept. Which is important to remember, because when we get to Trotsky, his alternative, there is a different path, which is much more warlike, that you could have taken, but that wasn't taken in history. The other element of Stalinism is industrialism. So you have these two connotations. You have this kind of nationalism, and the other part, the big part about Stalin, is his big push forward. Stalin wanted to develop Russia, right? He placed a very heavy emphasis on industry and development. He thought that, well, since Russia stands alone, it's up to us. Nobody's going to help us. We need to industrialize. We need to be an independent country. We need to be as strong as our enemies. And we're not, right? We're a backward farmer state. So we need to develop. We need to industrialize. We need to get to European level and beyond to survive this evil world. So he placed a lot of emphasis on this. Basically, everything became about the economy. So he abandoned a bit the Marxism here, right? And he went for a more top-down approach. He fully nationalized the economy. One of the only communists to actually do that. So everything became state-owned under him. And everything became planned. I explained you this last year with the top-down economy, how it was organized in Russia. So you'd have this immense bureaucracy of managers who would plan how every good gets produced. And it's kind of hard to imagine a bureaucracy on that scale, but it actually worked to some extent, like they did it. And he would prioritize industrial development, so heavy industry, steel industry, construction industry, these type of things. He would prioritize infrastructure, building bridges and roads and electricity and housing. So all resources went there. What he did not prioritize was consumption. You know, there was one type of marmalade, not two in the supermarket, right? He didn't really care. If you had something to eat, so shut up, right? It was not the point. And he also didn't prioritize agriculture, which was one of his weaker points. He didn't have too much patience with the farmers. He favored industrial development. So all the food was going to the cities to feed the workers, which left less food on the countryside, which caused excess mortality. Quite some people died in the 30s because of this on the countryside. That and bad weather, but he contributed to that. So this is where communism became this hardline top-down. The government